The city hummed with its familiar rhythm, neon lights flickering in the misty dusk as traffic crawled along the boulevard. In an upscale apartment overlooking it all, Thomas Wright poured himself a second glass of whiskey. The clink of ice echoed in the open-concept living room, blending with the distant city sounds and the gentle laugh of his wife, Natalie, from the next room. Their marriage from the outside was picture-perfect. Thomas was a successful architect, analytical, driven, with sharp blue eyes and a brooding handsomeness that had first drawn Natalie to him. Natalie, in turn, was a striking beauty with a keen mind, her warmth and wit lighting up every room she entered. Together, they commanded attention at every party, the kind of couple friends envied. But perfection, Thomas had learned, was a mask. Behind their social media smiles and dinner party charisma, a quiet restlessness gnawed at him. Their love life, once fiery, had cooled. The routines of work, bills, and the slow erosion of novelty had left their intimacy predictable, sometimes mechanical. Natalie seemed just as adrift, her eyes sometimes flickering with something unspoken, a hunger, perhaps, for adventure or for something neither could name. It was Thomas who first broke the silence. On a humid Friday night, after too much wine and with jazz curling softly from the speakers, he turned to Natalie and voiced the fantasy he'd nursed in secret, a desire to see her with another man. Not just any man, he was drawn, inexplicably, to the idea of her with someone different than him in every way. The idea was at once terrifying and intoxicating. Natalie stared at him, at first in disbelief, then with a slow, mischievous smile. "Are you serious?" she'd whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and excitement. He was. They spent that night talking until dawn, turning over every detail, dissecting desires and boundaries. Natalie's curiosity lit a spark between them that Thomas hadn't felt in years. For days afterward, he wondered if he'd unleashed something they couldn't control, but a thrill pulsed beneath the surface, stronger than fear. They dove into the world of online forums, reading stories, rules, warnings. Together, they set boundaries, honesty above all, safety, and the promise to stop if either felt lost. Thomas watched as Natalie became more animated, her eyes brightening with the forbidden. He felt both empowered and vulnerable, a current of jealousy and arousal rippling just below the surface. It was Natalie who suggested they take the next step. "If we're going to do this," she said, "let's find someone who excites us both. Someone real, someone safe." After careful, nervous scrolling and weeks of hesitant chatting, they found him. Marcus, a charismatic and well-built man with a magnetic presence, warm smile, and the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. He was different from Thomas in every way. A background built on grit rather than privilege, skin deep brown to Thomas's pale, laughter booming instead of reserved. The spark in Natalie's eyes as she read Marcus's messages was undeniable. They agreed to meet Marcus for drinks at a high-end lounge near the riverfront. Thomas wore his best suit, trying to project calm, though his heart raced. Natalie took extra time with her makeup, her perfume a trail of jasmine and anticipation. At the bar, Marcus's presence filled the space even before he spoke. His voice was deep, easy, his smile disarming. Conversation flowed, jokes, stories, subtle glances. Natalie laughed in a way Thomas hadn't heard in years. Thomas felt both pride and the first raw edge of envy. After that night, the plan began to take shape. They agreed on ground rules, texted about wants and limits, and finally set a date. The night before the encounter, Thomas lay awake, Natalie asleep beside him. He replayed everything. Her laughter, Marcus's confidence, his own conflicted excitement. He wondered if this would bring them closer, or if he was tempting fate with a fantasy too powerful to control. But as dawn crept across the city skyline and the promise of something new shimmered in the pale light, Thomas made a choice. He would follow this desire to its edge, wherever it might lead. Unbeknownst to him, the night would be the first ripple in a storm that would turn passion to obsession and curiosity to tragedy. Saturday evening arrived with an electric anticipation neither Thomas nor Natalie could completely hide. The day was a blur of nervous energy. Thomas busied himself with chores, checking the time compulsively, while Natalie alternated between excitement and guilt as she selected her dress, her lipstick, her jewelry. They had decided everything in advance. Marcus would join them at their apartment. No public spectacle, no risk of being spotted by acquaintances. It was private, controlled, and, at least in theory, safe. When Marcus texted, "On my way," a final wave of nerves swept through them both. Thomas poured 2 glasses of wine. Natalie checked her reflection for the 10th time, running her hands down the fabric of her black dress. "You're beautiful," Thomas said, and she smiled, soft, a little frightened, and deeply grateful for the reassurance. At exactly 8, the intercom rang. Marcus's deep voice echoed from the lobby, and Thomas buzzed him in. The sound of footsteps up the stairwell felt impossibly loud. When Marcus stepped through the door, he carried an aura of confidence and good humor that seemed to fill the space, as if he belonged there. He handed Natalie a single white lily, joking, flowers for the occasion. She flushed, caught off guard, and Thomas saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before it softened into appreciation. They made small talk over wine, sports, music, the city's best restaurants. Marcus was attentive, smiling at Natalie's jokes, including Thomas in every conversation, careful never to overstep the invisible boundaries. But underneath the casual chatter, the air was thick with expectation. After a second glass of wine, Marcus asked if they wanted to move somewhere more comfortable. The 3 settled on the large, sectional sofa, the city lights winking beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Natalie curled her feet beneath her, Marcus on one end and Thomas beside her, acting as both participant and guardian. They talked and laughed, tension winding around them, hearts beating faster as the evening slipped by. At some point, Marcus's hand found Natalie's. She looked at Thomas searchingly. Her husband nodded, trying to mask the pang of jealousy with a reassuring smile. Natalie took a breath and leaned in to kiss Marcus, softly at first, then with a growing hunger that made Thomas's chest tighten and his pulse thunder in his ears. He watched, fighting a swirl of emotions: excitement, insecurity, a strange pride, and the unmistakable spark of envy. Marcus was gentle, attentive. He checked in with Natalie, always conscious of signals, asking if she was all right. She responded with laughter and little gasps of pleasure, sounds Thomas had almost forgotten, or perhaps had never quite heard in the same way. It was thrilling, but it was also a razor's edge, cutting through the fantasy with flashes of doubt. Thomas tried to maintain control, reminding himself of the rules, his rules. He was there, watching, present. But as Marcus's hands slid over Natalie's skin as she moaned and arched toward him, something deeper and wilder awoke in Thomas. A jealousy unlike anything he'd ever known. He had thought he could handle this, that he could compartmentalize desire and envy, but the feelings bled together, hot and raw and uncontrollable. The elevator whirred outside, and in that moment, Thomas realized the world was still going on as usual. Neighbors came and went, the city pulsed with its midnight rhythm, oblivious to the private drama unfolding in his home. The hours passed in shimmering waves of sensation, pleasure, and conflicting emotion. When it was over, Marcus dressed quietly, kissed Natalie's hand, and nodded to Thomas. "Thank you for the trust." After Marcus left, silence filled the apartment. Natalie tucked her hair behind her ear, searching Thomas's face. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Thomas hesitated, unsure of what to say. He reached for her, drawing her close, and for a moment, they simply held each other. "I think so," he whispered, but the truth felt far more complex. They lay in bed later, the city's distant noises drifting through the open window. Natalie traced patterns on Thomas's chest, her mind as restless as his. "Did we do something wrong?" she murmured. Thomas kissed her forehead. "No, we did what we wanted. We were honest." But as sleep eluded him, Thomas stared up at the ceiling, feeling at once more connected to Natalie than he had in years, and more alone than he'd thought possible. He didn't realize then that he'd invited not just a stranger into their bed, but a storm into their marriage, a force that would soon become impossible to control. For days after Marcus's visit, Thomas and Natalie found themselves in a strange, exhilarating haze. The air between them crackled with new energy. They kissed longer in the mornings, touched more often, and laughed like they hadn't in years. Their conversations were raw, honest, sometimes hesitant, but mostly alive in a way that felt dangerous and addictive. Yet, beneath their rediscovered intimacy, small fissures began to split the foundation of their trust. Each lover interpreted the night's events differently. For Natalie, there was a growing desire, a hunger awakened, her confidence swelling with each recollection of Marcus's attentive touch. She caught herself daydreaming, then guiltily forced her thoughts away. Still, the memory tempted her, thrilling, addictive, and somehow empowering. For Thomas, the experience was more complicated. He had convinced himself that seeing Natalie with another man would only feed his fantasies, bring them closer, and put him in control. Instead, he found his thoughts circling a darker place. The image of Marcus and Natalie together replayed in his mind with knife-like clarity. Sometimes it fueled his excitement. Sometimes it left him hollow and cold. Natalie sensed his discomfort. One evening, as they prepared dinner, she placed a gentle hand on his back. "Are you sure you're okay?" Thomas forced a smile. "I am. It's just new. I wasn't prepared for how real it would feel." "I know." She hesitated. "We don't have to do it again, Tom." He shook his head, almost too quickly. Jealousy and pride warred inside him. "No, I'm glad we did it. I just need some time." But the seed had been planted. While neither said it aloud, both knew that some rules had quietly begun to erode. They had agreed it would be a one-time thing, a shared adventure to satisfy curiosity. But now, the idea of repeating the experience hung between them, unspoken but vibrant. Natalie found herself texting Marcus. At first, their conversations were polite, surface-level banter. But quickly they deepened. Their messages became flirtatious, sometimes provocative, laced with inside jokes and a private language that Thomas didn't share. Thomas noticed, but said nothing. He told himself he trusted Natalie, that the boundaries they'd set still held. But late at night, her phone buzzed with messages, and she would bite her lip, smiling at the screen. Jealousy gnawed at him, a vicious cycle of wanting and resenting what he had invited into their lives. One Saturday, Natalie suggested they invite Marcus over again, just for drinks and conversation. Thomas hesitated, but Natalie's insistence and the memory of their renewed intimacy pushed him to agree. This time, the meeting felt less formal, more charged. Marcus arrived with a bottle of wine and an easy grin, slipping into their lives as if he'd always been a part of them. Conversation was easier, the tension more familiar. They played a card game, shared stories, and, as the night wore on, the distance between the three melted away. Natalie's hands found Marcus's, and soon their laughter turned to whispered flirtations. Thomas watched, torn between the heady rush of living his fantasy and the sting of being an outsider in his own home. This time, when they moved to the bedroom, there were fewer checks and pauses. Their boundaries blurred. Marcus and Natalie's chemistry was unmistakable, and Thomas was drawn into the current, sometimes participating, sometimes only watching, sometimes turning away. Afterwards, as Marcus left in the early morning, Thomas lay awake beside Natalie, filled with conflicting emotions he couldn't name. Something tangible had shifted. The rules, so carefully constructed, now lay in pieces. In the days that followed, Thomas became hyper-aware of Natalie's every move. He noticed her new confidence, the lightness in her step. She was more affectionate with him, but also more distracted, often lost in thought, sometimes quick to defend Marcus whenever his name came up. Their friends began to notice, too. There was an edge to Thomas's voice when Marcus's name was mentioned, an awkwardness when Natalie disappeared to answer a call or reply to a message. Even their closest confidants couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed, but the Wrights' perfect couple image was beginning to show cracks. Thomas tried to regain control. He suggested they take a break, focus on each other, leave the fantasy behind. Natalie protested, not angrily, but with a quiet intensity that startled him. "Tom, you were the one who wanted this. I feel alive for the first time in years." He tried to explain what he was feeling, but the words came out wrong. "It's not about you and Marcus. It's about us. I just want to be enough for you." Natalie touched his face gently. "You are, but this is different. I can love you and still want more." The truth, spoken so plainly, crushed him. He realized he had opened a door he could never fully close. What started as a game had become something deeper, messier, an addiction. And somewhere in that realization, a dangerous idea began to take root. If he couldn't control the fantasy, maybe he could control the outcome. But the cost of breaking all the rules was only just beginning to reveal itself. Summer crept in, and with it came long, restless nights for Thomas. The windows of their apartment remained open for any hint of cool air, but nothing could ease the heat pulsing between husband and wife. Natalie was different now. Her laughter brighter, her glances sharper, her energy somehow untouchable. Thomas watched her move through their days with a confidence he both admired and envied. Their affair with Marcus was no longer a single, unrepeatable adventure. It was a secret undercurrent running through their marriage, a world they slipped into with increasing frequency. Marcus's texts became nightly fixtures. A secret language thrived between him and Natalie. Even when Thomas tried to focus on work, he'd catch Natalie smiling at her phone, her thumb dancing across the screen. One evening, when Thomas arrived home early and found Natalie on the balcony, her cheeks flushed, he didn't have to ask. She was on a call with Marcus. The conversation ended quickly when Thomas appeared, but the look in her eyes, guilt mixed with excitement, was unmistakable. Jealousy, once an abstract worry, now landed with real weight. Thomas felt himself shrinking in his own home, his role as husband clouded by the presence of a man he had invited in. He tried to talk about it, stumbling over his words. I don't know if I want this anymore, Nat," he confessed one night as they lay in the dark. Natalie turned, her voice gentle but firm. "Tom, you said we'd be honest. I love you, but I can't pretend the world went back to how it was." His heart ached at her honesty. He wanted to believe they could rein in what they started, press pause, and find their way back to normal. But what was normal now? The rules were gone, and everything familiar felt warped. The next weekend, they agreed to meet Marcus for drinks. Neutral ground, crowded restaurant, bright lights. Thomas hoped the public space would dampen the spark. Instead, the chemistry was undeniable. Marcus and Natalie exchanged little jokes and glances. Thomas tried to insert himself, but felt more like a spectator. When Natalie excused herself to the restroom, Marcus leaned in, his voice low. "Are we good, Tom? Still cool?" Thomas nodded, forcing a thin smile. "Yeah, of course." But the lie twisted inside him. That night back home, Thomas's mind raced. He replayed every touch, every word, every look. He felt powerless in a situation he had set in motion. Natalie reached for him, sensing his distance, but her comfort only made him feel smaller. He started to notice other things, too. How Natalie's perfume lingered after she'd spent time with Marcus. The way she hummed while folding laundry. The way she defended Marcus in small, inconsequential arguments. These details compounded, echoing in Thomas's mind and fanning the embers of his jealousy. One night, after a fight over dinner, so trivial it was almost comical, Natalie blurted, "Why do you have to make this so hard? You wanted this. Why are you punishing me for enjoying it?" He stared at her, unable to answer. For a moment, both saw their fractured reflection. Two people searching for connection, spinning further apart. The next day, Thomas scrolled through their text history, looking for proof of something. Betrayal? Love? He wasn't even sure. Jealousy's sting was no longer a fantasy. It was real, burning, and it was only getting sharper. Thomas's world grew smaller, even as his anxieties grew larger. He thought about Marcus at work, while showering, even in his sleep. Their apartment, once a place of refuge, now felt like a crossroads where desire, resentment, and confusion collided daily. Natalie's every move was sharper in his mind. Her laughter on the phone, her long silences after Marcus left, the way she kept her phone just out of sight. One evening, Thomas came home to find Natalie sitting on their bed, staring out the window with a faraway look. She barely registered his arrival. "Rough day," he offered, trying to sound casual. She turned and forced a tired, distracted smile. "Just thinking." He was about to ask about what, but stopped himself. The question felt futile. He already knew the answer, even if he didn't want to hear it. Shadows clouded her face. She was drifting, and for the first time, he feared she wouldn't come back. Their conversations became careful, filled with half-truths and long pauses. The honesty they once celebrated had devolved into a dance of omissions. Sometimes Thomas wanted to reach out, to pull Natalie close and demand that she choose him or Marcus, their life or this new thrill. Other times, he felt paralyzed by the thought of losing her. He hated the jealousy, but he feared the emptiness more. On a rainy Wednesday, Thomas found himself lingering in a nearby cafe, avoiding home. He watched the rain streak down the windows, blurring the city lights into watercolor smears. His phone buzzed. "Natalie, running late. Don't wait up." He stared at the message, a heaviness pressing down on his chest. Part of him wanted to call her, to demand an explanation. The other part, the one growing darker by the day, simply gave up. That night, Natalie came home after midnight. She moved quietly, but Thomas was awake, listening. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her as she slid into bed beside him. He just lay still, heart pounding, eyes wide in the darkness. A few days later, Thomas tried again to talk. "Are we okay?" he asked over breakfast, his voice carrying the weight of desperation. Natalie looked up, her eyes tired. "I don't know, Tom. Are we?" He swallowed hard, searching her face for a sign. "I just want to understand," he managed. "Is it more than sex?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Thomas felt the last remnants of certainty crumble. "I don't know how to explain it," she finally said. "It's like I'm living a different life when I'm with him. It's not about love, but it's not nothing either." He nodded, too numb to process her words. "And what about us?" She reached across the table, took his hand. "I love you, but I don't know how to make you believe it right now." The shadows grew, thickening around both of them. Thomas started to doubt everything. Natalie's love, his own decisions, even reality itself. At work, his performance slipped. Friends commented on his distracted state. He withdrew from social circles, finding solace in long walks around the city at night, the anonymity of the dark streets offering a mute kind of comfort. Meanwhile, Marcus's presence remained an unspoken reality between them. Sometimes he and Thomas exchanged stiff, almost cordial texts about logistics, when to meet, who would be on which side of the arrangement. Sometimes there was only silence. Natalie's glow, the electric confidence she'd gained, now flickered with uncertainty. She was fighting her own battle, guilt gnawing at her, unsure if she was forging a new future or running from one that no longer fit. One evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Thomas caught his reflection in a rain-streaked window. He barely recognized the man glaring back. Not the self-assured husband who once believed in the strength of his marriage, but a haunted stranger drowning in doubts. It was then he realized their marriage was no longer theirs alone. The shadows Marcus had brought did not recede with sunrise. They lived in every silence, every glance, every restless night. And Thomas, torn between desire and despair, began to fear what might happen if he couldn't bring the light back. Jealousy had already taken root in Thomas, but now it was obsession that dictated his days and haunted his nights. He scrolled through Natalie's messages when she was in the shower, his hands shaking, heart pounding with each notification, hoping he wouldn't find anything, but unable to stop searching. Every missed call from Marcus, every half-glimpsed text, felt like another betrayal. The boundaries that once gave him comfort had dissolved. Natalie no longer tried to hide her excitement for Marcus, and Thomas, in return, stopped trying to pretend that everything was fine. Their silences grew longer, sharper. Words were replaced by looks, some pleading, some accusing. The trust that had supported their open arrangement was gone, and now, Thomas watched Natalie as if she were a stranger sharing his home. Marcus, too, sensed the darkness rising. When they met, Thomas's questions became more pointed, tinged with hostility. "Are you serious about her? Or is this just a game to you?" he asked one night, his voice low but edged with threat. Marcus raised his hands in defense. "Man, I'm not trying to take her from you. This is about what you both wanted, isn't it?" But Thomas heard nothing reassuring in those words. Marcus's confidence, once magnetic, now felt predatory, a constant reminder of what Thomas was losing. He watched as Natalie laughed more freely with Marcus, her guard down, her attention focused solely on the other man. It stung, and the wound festered. At work, Thomas became distracted, often caught staring blankly at his computer. He missed deadlines, snapped at colleagues, and avoided friends. His supervisor pulled him aside, expressing concern, but Thomas brushed it off, offering excuses he barely believed himself. Back home, Natalie noticed his decline, but felt powerless to help. Their attempts to talk always slid into circular arguments, Thomas accusing, Natalie defending, neither satisfied. Sleep became elusive. Thomas would listen to Natalie's breathing at night, his mind filled with doubts and worst-case scenarios. Sometimes he imagined her slipping out of bed while he slept, running to Marcus's apartment, cheating not just physically but emotionally, crossing an invisible line that could never be repaired. One particularly bad night, Thomas followed Natalie after she said she was meeting a friend for coffee. His heart thudded as he watched her enter a bar and, moments later, greet Marcus with a long embrace. They sat close, their heads touching as they talked, lost in their own world. Thomas remained across the street, staring through the window, fury burning a hole in his chest. He confronted her when she returned, unable to hold back. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? You said you were meeting Kelly, but you were with him." Again, Natalie flinched at his tone. "Tom, you can't do this, not after everything we've shared. I'm not hiding anything from you." "Then why lie?" His voice cracked with anger and heartbreak. "I didn't want another fight," she replied. Tears welled in her eyes, but Thomas was too far gone to comfort her. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving her sobbing on the floor. Alone, Thomas walked for hours under the city's sodium glow, replaying every moment, every choice that had brought them here. He was consumed by the urge to regain control, to reclaim the life slipping through his fingers. The next day, he called in sick, spending hours online reading bitter tales of broken hearts and ruined marriages. He lurked on forums, searching for answers for a way out. Some advised ending things, moving on. Others preached revenge, justice, drastic solutions. Thomas felt himself teetering on a dangerous edge. That evening, Natalie, exhausted and wrung out, tried to reach him once more. "We can't go on like this. I love you, but I can't live in a war zone." Thomas stared at her, his voice cold. "You already left, Nat. You just haven't moved out yet." Neither spoke for a long time. Outside, thunder rolled and rain pelted the city, making their silence feel even more absolute. For the first time, Thomas wondered if the marriage he tried to save was already gone, if he was fighting for a ghost. But obsession has a way of blinding reason. Even as doubt gnawed at him, Thomas found himself plotting, quietly, desperately, refusing to let go. The days slipped by in a fog of tension and suspicion. Thomas and Natalie barely spoke except to exchange the information necessary to keep up appearances, plans, errands, the bare minimum to maintain the illusion of domestic life. Marcus's presence hovered over everything like a shadow no light could dispel. Thomas's world became defined by surveillance. He monitored Natalie's movements, checked her phone when she left it in the kitchen, even took to following her on occasion. Each discovery, an innocent message from Marcus, a calendar reminder for drinks, pushed him further from the man he remembered himself to be. But Natalie, too, was suffering. She found herself withdrawing from friends, burdened by the double life she'd never intended to live. She saw pain in Thomas's eyes every time she laughed at Marcus's jokes, real joy soured by guilt. She wondered if this new world of freedom and excitement was worth the price she was paying. The tension fractured their social circle as well. Friends, once enthusiastic about the right's modern openness, grew uneasy. Invitations to parties slowed. Mutual friends took sides, some defending Natalie's right to explore, others siding with Thomas's pain. The sense of community that had anchored their marriage dissolved, leaving both feeling alone in a crowd. One afternoon, searching for answers, Natalie met with her oldest friend, Megan, in a quiet park. She confessed everything: Marcus, the jealousy, Thomas's coldness. Megan listened silently, then squeezed Natalie's hand. "You have to decide what you really want, Nat. You can't keep living in between. You'll destroy yourself and him." Meanwhile, Thomas grew reckless. He confronted Marcus outside his gym after work, surprising himself with the force of his words. "Stay away from her. You've had your fun." Marcus, taken aback but not intimidated, held his ground. "She's her own person, Tom. I didn't force anything." Thomas's fists clenched, but he kept himself in check, the argument ending with a promise heavier than any threat. "If you don't back off, someone's going to get hurt." The warning settled like a curse over the days that followed. At home, Thomas and Natalie's arguments became more frequent and desperate. "Do you love him?" Thomas demanded after one particularly savage fight. Natalie, exhausted, shook her head. "No, Tom, but I love how he makes me feel wanted, free, alive." "And what about us?" Thomas's voice broke. Tears fell down Natalie's cheeks. "I wish I knew." Desperate for a solution, Natalie suggested time apart. A trial separation, perhaps, or counseling. Thomas balked at the idea, taking it instead as proof she'd chosen Marcus over him. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas poured himself a drink and sat on the balcony, staring at the flickering city. He remembered the first night he'd told Natalie his fantasy, how excited she had looked, how much hope he'd felt. Now all he saw was loss. At that moment, Natalie texted Marcus, asking to meet. She needed to talk, to find closure, or at least clarity. Marcus agreed, one last time. Thomas, returning inside to see the light blinking on Natalie's phone, read the message. Fury, heartbreak, and fear collided in his chest. He didn't know what he'd do next. He just knew he couldn't lose everything. The secrets they had both nurtured were unraveling fast, pulling each of them toward a night that would rewrite all their stories forever. Rain hammered the city in relentless sheets, turning every street lamp halo into a blurred watercolor. Thomas sat in his car outside Marcus's apartment complex, knuckles white on the steering wheel. He had followed Natalie here, watching as she hurried through the rain and disappeared into the lobby with barely a glance over her shoulder. The betrayal felt absolute. The affair, the lies, the creeping distance. Tonight, it all reached its boiling point. Thomas's thoughts churned with rage, grief, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made every breath heavy. He sat for nearly half an hour, pacing himself with shallow breaths, battling the urge to leave or to storm inside. Ultimately, anger won. He got out, slammed the car door, and strode into the building, rain streaming from his coat. Inside Marcus's apartment, the mood was tense but not unfriendly. Natalie sat on the couch, soaked to the skin, while Marcus offered her a towel and a warm drink. "I'm sorry," she said, clutching the mug. "I just needed to talk to someone who understands where this is going." Marcus nodded. "We can talk as long as you want, Nat, whatever you need." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Marcus opened it to find Thomas, eyes wild, hair plastered to his forehead with rain. "What are you doing here?" Natalie cried, her voice small and panicked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stepped past Marcus, glancing at the scene, the towels, the two mugs on the table. "So this is it," he spat. "Right here, under my nose." Marcus tried to intervene, hands raised. "Tom, calm down. Nothing happened tonight. You need to go home." Thomas advanced, getting in Marcus's face. "You think you're a better man than me? You think you could just walk in and take my wife, take my life?" The room vibrated with tension. Natalie tried to calm Thomas. placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Please, please, Tom, let's just talk." But Thomas was beyond words. He shoved Marcus hard, sending him stumbling into the kitchen counter. Natalie screamed. Marcus, caught off guard, tried to defend himself. The two men wrestled, anger and heartbreak fueling their struggle. Natalie tried to wedge herself between them, sobbing and pleading for them to stop. A lamp crashed to the floor. Thomas, breath wheezing, grabbed a heavy glass candle holder and swung blindly. The object connected with a sickening crack against Marcus's skull. Marcus collapsed to the ground, blood already pooling beneath his head. A stunned silence descended, broken only by Natalie's scream echoing off the apartment walls. Thomas stared in horror at what he'd done, frozen, the weapon slipping from his bloody fingers. Natalie fell to Marcus's side, hands shaking as she pressed uselessly at the wound. "Call 911, she screamed. Thomas fumbled for his phone, hands numb, voice breaking as he relayed the address to the dispatcher. Sirens howled through the storm outside, growing louder by the second. Marcus's breaths became ragged, then slipped away altogether before help arrived. By the time paramedics burst through the door, it was too late. The rest unfolded in a blur. Police lights painting the wet pavement, Thomas in handcuffs, Natalie wrapped in a blanket, sobbing hysterically as she answered endless questions she could barely process. The night had started in search of closure and ended in irreversible loss. For all three, there was no going back, only the cold, stark reality of what had been destroyed by love, obsession, and a fantasy gone fatally wrong. The headlines were everywhere the next morning. Jealous husband kills wife's lover in deadly love triangle, screamed the tabloids, while the more measured outlets called it a tragic escalation of an unconventional marriage. The city buzzed with rumor and speculation, but for Thomas and Natalie, the world had shrunk to the suffocating walls of police stations and courtrooms. Thomas sat beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of a holding cell, replaying the night's events on an endless loop. He saw Natalie's tear-streaked face, heard the crack of the candle holder striking Marcus, felt the blood sticky on his hands. The rage that had consumed him now curdled to horror and regret. Hour after hour, he told his story to detectives. How a fantasy once meant to bring excitement and connection had led to heartbreak, betrayal, and now death. Natalie, meanwhile, was a shell of her former self. She spent hours in a windowless interview room, repeating the details over and over for the officers and for her own exhausted mind. The questions were endless. When had the affair begun? How often had she met Marcus? Had she ever feared Thomas would become violent? Had she, even for a moment, wanted this outcome? When she was released to her mother's care, the apartment she returned to was unrecognizable. Police tape still hung in the hallway. The shattered lamp and the blood stain on the carpet had been taken as evidence, but their absence was more haunting than their presence. Natalie wandered from room to room, haunted by the echoes of the life she and Thomas had shared, now irreparably broken. The legal process moved quickly. Thomas was charged with manslaughter, his defense hinging on claims of temporary insanity and provocation. His lawyer painted a portrait of a man pushed past his breaking point by jealousy and betrayal, a sympathetic figure, undone by love. The prosecution countered with a narrative of dangerous obsession, warning the jury that passion could never justify violence. Friends and family were called to testify, each forced to grapple with what they had seen and suspected. Megan, Natalie's oldest friend, spoke of her concern for Natalie's well-being, of the increasing tension in the marriage. Others described Thomas as loyal but intense, a man who loved deeply and feared losing control. Natalie took the stand last. Her voice trembled as she described the night of the murder, not to excuse Thomas, but to show the complexity of what had occurred. "We let a fantasy take over our lives," she said quietly. "We lost ourselves, and I lost the man I loved long before that night." The closing arguments left the jury silent and somber. Was Thomas a husband pushed to madness, or a man unable to accept the consequences of his own desires? Would justice heal anyone involved, or only underline the loss? In the end, the verdict was delivered, guilty of manslaughter. The punishment would be years in prison, years in which Thomas would relive his decisions in solitude. For Natalie, the trial's conclusion brought no relief. The story was over, but the pain remained, a dull ache inside her chest that no legal judgment could remove. As the courthouse emptied, Natalie stood on the steps, the city roaring around her. The truth was that everyone had lost something: a lover, a husband, a future. In the space left behind by tragedy, there were only questions about desire, trust, and how love, once so bright, could lead two people to such darkness. Months passed, but time offered little comfort to those left behind. Rose-colored memories of Thomas and Natalie's marriage faded, replaced by headlines, whispered rumors, and the inescapable ache of loss. What began as a boundary-pushing fantasy had become a cautionary tale throughout their community. Friends who once admired their boldness now found themselves whispering judgments they were once too polite to voice. For Thomas, prison was both a punishment and an unending mirror to the choices he'd made. Every day was like reliving the night of Marcus's death, moments looping endlessly, questions echoing unanswered. He cataloged each misstep, tracing the slow unraveling of trust and the split second where rage eclipsed love. Occasionally, a letter arrived from Natalie. At first, she wrote with trembling hope, apologies, regrets, searching for closure. Over time, her words became more distant, until even those letters ceased, leaving Thomas with only silence and his remorse. Natalie, having moved back in her childhood home, struggled to rebuild any sense of normalcy. She found work at a local gallery, keeping her head down, losing herself in art and the solace of routine. She attended therapy sessions, sometimes alone, sometimes with her mother at her side. The wounds still felt fresh, but she slowly learned to name her guilt without allowing it to swallow her whole. There were days she replayed her life with Thomas, not to justify, but simply to remember the good as well as the ruin. Marcus's absence was felt most acutely by his friends and family, who remembered his laughter and warmth. A candlelit memorial was held in the park where he used to jog, friends gathering in quiet circles and sharing stories. For them, the question of blame was as tangled as love itself. Was Marcus reckless or simply generous with his affection? Had he stepped into a marriage already set to combust? Those questions never found answers, only a bittersweet peace with what would never be known. Life moved forward in small, tentative steps. Natalie eventually found the courage to move out on her own. She started running by the river, the same route she and Thomas once walked, and let the wind and water remind her that she was still alive. She reconnected with Megan, whose steady friendship became her anchor. She even laughed, on rare occasions, surprised at her own resilience. For Thomas, the future was narrower, but not entirely without hope. He read, kept to himself, and planned for the day he might see Natalie again, though he never presumed forgiveness. He wrote a letter he never sent, admitting, "Love is never as simple as a fantasy. I want to be brave, but I ended up afraid of losing you, of losing myself. I'm sorry for every step that took us here." In the end, the tragedy left no clear villains and no real heroes. Only people who loved and wanted, who made mistakes and paid dearly for them. The echoes of their story lingered, an enduring testament to the fine line between desire and destruction, and to the truth that some games, once started, cannot be played in reverse. As winter melted into spring, Natalie stood at the edge of the park, letting the sun warm her face. She breathed deeply, feeling the ache and the hope of beginning again, no longer afraid of shadows, determined to find light once more.